When I tell people I used to pay my brother's rent for 5 straight years, they look at me like I'm insane. And maybe I was, at least a little bit. But when you grow up the oldest son in a house where guilt is served hotter than dinner, you learn early on that family first doesn't mean help each other. It means sacrifice yourself. My name's Harry, I'm 33, and this story has been brewing for over a decade. I've stayed quiet for most of it, convinced that if I just kept being the bigger person, everything would work out. Turns out, being the bigger person only makes you a bigger target. I'm not going to start by bashing my brother, even though part of me really wants to. His name's Brandon, he's 29, and I used to think of him as the golden boy. Not because he was brilliant or hardworking or even kind. He was none of those things, but because my parents, especially my mom, treated him like he'd been personally carved from marble by the gods. If he got a C in high school, it was the teacher's fault. If he forgot to show up to our grandmother's funeral, it was because he was too emotional to handle grief. Meanwhile, I was the one who had to pick her casket, sign the paperwork, and make sure no one fought over the estate. Which, yes, they still did. I moved out at 19, got a job at a tech support firm, and started putting myself through night classes. No handouts, no help. No, we'll cover rent so you can focus on school talk. Just work, bills, and grinding through it all. I graduated at 24, got into software QA, and slowly built up a pretty stable life. Nothing flashy, just a decent apartment, a reliable car, and some peace and quiet. The kind of peace that doesn't last when your little brother calls you crying because mom said you'd help. Brandon was 23 then, freshly kicked out of his third college, and allegedly on the verge of launching a startup. I asked what kind. He said, a tech one. No details, no plan, just vibes and buzzwords. My parents had just co-signed his lease for a downtown apartment, but after 2 months, they realized he wasn't paying anything. They threatened to pull out. Brandon panicked. Mom called me, and I still remember the exact words she used. He's just lost right now, Harry. He needs time. Don't you want your brother to succeed? So I said fine. I'd cover the rent. 1 month. Just one. You already know where this is going. 1 month turned into 3. Then a year. Then 2. By the time we hit the 5-year mark, I'd spent enough to put a down payment on a house. All while Brandon kept promising, the app is coming along, man. I just need investors. He never worked more than a few weeks at a time. He'd start a delivery job, then quit because the hours weren't good for his creativity. He'd claim he was networking, but every time I visited, he was either gaming or sleeping till noon. And somehow, my parents still sang his praises. Every family dinner, it was Brandon's doing big things, and Harry, you're lucky to have a front row seat when it all pays off. I bit my tongue for years. I told myself I was helping. That maybe, just maybe, this would be the push he needed to grow up. But then last fall, something shifted. I was up for a huge promotion, one that would bump my salary by 40% and put me on track for management. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to jinx it. I just worked late, prepped hard, and nailed the internal interviews. When I got the offer email, I sat alone in my apartment, stared at the screen, and cried. Not because of the money, but because I finally felt like all those sleepless nights and double shifts had meant something. That same night, Brandon called. Hey bro. So, I might need help with rent again. I kinda spent the last of it buying a lens for my camera. What camera? I asked. My new project, he said. I'm doing this short film about broken family dynamics. Very experimental. I told him no. For the first time in years, I told him no. Not rudely. Not angrily. Just firmly. I said, Brandon, I've done enough. It's time you figure it out yourself. There was silence. Then, wow. I didn't think you'd turn your back on me like that. I'm not turning my back. I'm letting go of the rope you've been yanking on. He hung up. For a few weeks, nothing happened. I thought maybe he was mad, but finally facing reality. Then, 2 Sundays later, I got a knock on my door. Registered mail. A manila envelope. Inside, court papers. Brandon was suing me. The claim? That I had interfered with his career trajectory by providing unstable financial support that ultimately crippled his independence, and that I owed him damages for lost creative revenue and emotional distress caused by implied financial coercion. I read the words at least 10 times before I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe it was real. He had an actual lawyer. The hearing was scheduled for the following month. And when I told my parents, they were, get this, furious at me. You must have said something to provoke him. You always made him feel small. You know he's sensitive, Harry. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the ground had split open under me, and everyone I thought I could trust was standing on the other side, watching me fall. But then, something clicked. I remembered every rent transfer, every email, every message where Brandon thanked me and called me a lifesaver. I remembered the time I co-signed his second lease when he lost his wallet and needed someone to talk to the landlord. I remembered the credit card in my name he begged to use just for gas, and then maxed out on studio lighting. I had receipts. So many receipts. So I started printing, compiling, organizing. Late nights of digging through bank statements and old messages. A paper trail of 5 years of guilt, manipulation, and me being the only one who ever put anything on the line. And when the court day came, I walked in with a folder. A thick, tabbed, color-coded folder. Brandon was already there, in a blazer 2 sizes too big, trying to look like a wounded artist. His lawyer looked half-bored. My parents were in the back, whispering and frowning at me like I'd just crashed a wedding. The judge called us up, asked for opening statements. Brandon's lawyer spoke like this was an obvious open-and-shut case. My client was misled into a dependent financial arrangement that stifled his entrepreneurial growth. He said those words, with a straight face. Then the judge turned to me. I said, "Your Honor, I have some documentation I'd like to submit." She nodded. I handed her the folder. She flipped to the first page, read for a few seconds, and then looked up at my brother. Her expression didn't change much, but there was this moment, this pause, where I saw something flicker in her eyes. She held the page in the air and said, flatly, "You really thought this would work?" The courtroom didn't fall silent. It already was. But after the judge said those words, "You really thought this would work?" it felt like the air got sucked out of the room. Brandon looked stunned, like someone had slapped him with a wet towel. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but he kept his eyes on the judge like he couldn't believe she wasn't on his side. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, hands folded in front of me, reminding myself to breathe. The judge skimmed through the next couple pages, pausing here and there. I'd included screenshots of rent payments, a timeline of every financial transfer, text messages where Brandon called me the only reason I'm still afloat. Even a couple of emails to our parents thanking me for helping him through the worst years of his life. I had no idea if it would be enough to win, but from the judge's tone and the way she kept raising her eyebrows, I knew I'd at least made a dent. "I'll need time to review this thoroughly," she finally said, closing the folder. "We'll reconvene in 2 weeks. I suggest both parties come prepared to clarify their positions." She gave Brandon a long look, and for the first time in 5 years, I saw something flicker across his face that looked like doubt. Or fear. Maybe both. I didn't speak to him on the way out. My parents didn't speak to me either. My mom just shook her head like I'd embarrassed her. My dad muttered, "This is tearing the family apart." And for once, I didn't chase them. I didn't try to explain. I got in my car, drove home, and sat in the dark for almost an hour. The next few days were quiet. No texts from Brandon. No "bro come on" guilt trips. Nothing. I started to think maybe he'd realized how insane this was. That maybe, finally, he'd feel a little shame. But that's the thing about people like Brandon. They don't reflect. They deflect. Because on the 5th day after the hearing, I got a knock on my door. It was my landlord. He looked uncomfortable. Said he didn't want to get involved, but someone had called claiming I was running an illegal business out of the apartment and that there might be unlicensed software activity going on. I almost laughed in his face. Brandon had stooped to anonymous tips now? "It's probably nothing," my landlord said, but the implication was clear. Someone was trying to cause problems, and not even subtle ones. A week later, HR at my job emailed me. Apparently, someone had sent an anonymous message to my company's ethics hotline claiming I'd falsified my resume and was taking bribes from software vendors. The whole thing was nonsense, obviously, but it triggered an internal review. My manager apologized and said it was just protocol, but I knew. I knew exactly who was behind it. I spent every day that week in a haze of anxiety, jumping at every email, waiting for another blow. My hands shook. I couldn't sleep. And through it all, I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head. "He's just going through something." As if that excused everything. As if it ever had. The review cleared me. Of course it did. But by then, The damage had already started to show. I wasn't eating. I was snapping at coworkers. I'd stopped going to the gym. And that's when my friend Jordan, who's known me since college, sat me down and said, "You're letting this destroy you. Stop letting him live rent-free in your head after living rent-free in your life." It hit me harder than I expected, because it was true. I'd built my entire adult life trying to be the good son, the reliable one, the one who keeps the peace. And in doing so, I'd let everyone else walk over me like I was the rug keeping the house warm. That night, I started writing everything down. Not just for the judge, for myself. Every moment of guilt, every lie, every favor, that turned into a pattern. I mapped out the emotional manipulation like it was a case study. It was cathartic, but it also made me angry in a way I hadn't let myself feel before. And just when I thought I'd finally hit my emotional limit, the betrayal came. It was the Saturday before the next hearing. I was supposed to visit my parents for a casual dinner. I almost canceled. I should have, but a part of me thought maybe it was time to clear the air. Maybe they'd finally see reason. I was wrong. When I arrived, my mom opened the door with a tight smile. My dad gave me one of those awkward one-arm hugs. I stepped inside and immediately noticed something off. Brandon was already there. Not just there, sitting at the table like nothing had happened. Laughing, drinking wine. I froze. What's he doing here? He's still part of this family, my mom said quickly. We wanted to have a meal together. Like old times. Old times. I laughed hollow. Old times never existed. Brandon didn't say anything. He just raised his glass in my direction. Smirked. I turned to leave. Wait, my mom said. We actually wanted to talk to you about something important. I paused. Against my better judgment. She continued. We've been thinking about the hearing. And, well, we think it would be better if you settled this. Quietly. No more court. I blinked. You want me to drop it? No, my dad cut in. We want you to pay him a small settlement. Just to end it. He's agreed to lower the amount significantly. I stared at them. My own parents. Asking me to pay off the brother who tried to destroy my reputation. He's family, my mom said. Don't let pride get in the way. That was the moment something broke inside me. Pride? Pride hadn't paid Brandon's rent for 5 years. Pride hadn't covered his credit card bill when he ghosted the company. Pride hadn't kept me quiet when he crashed my car during a drunken joyride and begged me not to tell mom and dad. No, pride wasn't the problem. Enabling was. And here they were, enabling him again. I said nothing. I turned, walked out the door, got in my car, and drove straight to Jordan's apartment. I didn't even text ahead. When he opened the door, I was shaking with a kind of rage that felt radioactive. Tell me everything you know about revenge, I said. He blinked, then stepped aside and let me in. That night, something changed. I stopped thinking of myself as the victim. I started thinking like an engineer, a planner, a strategist. I'd spent years quietly building a life, supporting others, never asking for anything in return. Now, I was going to build something else. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to throw things. I wasn't going to write angry emails or confront them in public. I was going to be surgical, precise, every move calculated, every step backed by evidence. They wanted a quiet ending. I'd give them quiet, but not in the way they expected. The next 2 weeks were a blur of motion. I called in a favor from a friend who worked in digital forensics. Got help retrieving old texts Brandon had deleted. I hired a legal consultant to help me structure a counterclaim. I documented everything, from the anonymous tips to the dinner betrayal. I even started digging into Brandon's businesses and found out one of them was using pirated software tied directly to his IP address. By the time the second hearing rolled around, I had a full-blown dossier. I walked into the courtroom calm, composed, and dead-eyed. Brandon, on the other hand, looked rattled. His lawyer was visibly less confident this time. And when the judge asked if I had anything to submit, I handed over a second folder, thicker than the first. She flipped open the first page, read, and sighed. Mr. Thomas, she said, addressing Brandon, you've wasted this court's time. But I wasn't done. Your Honor, I said quietly, I would like to file a counterclaim for defamation, harassment, and malicious interference with employment. The room went still again. Brandon's face drained of color. My parents, sitting in the same spot as before, looked like someone had poured ice water over them. But that wasn't even the worst part. Because as the judge flipped to the evidence of Brandon's anonymous reports to my employer and the screenshots that tied his burner emails to his personal account, She said something that made everything worth it. She looked at him, then at his lawyer, and said, "You may want to advise your client to settle. This could get very expensive for him." And just as Brandon opened his mouth to object, the court clerk interrupted. She'd just received a delivery. A brown envelope, labeled Exhibit C. It was from a private investigator I'd hired 2 weeks earlier. The judge opened it, pulled out the contents. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked at me, then at Brandon. Then she said, "We'll need to reconvene. I'll be reviewing this in chambers." And she stood up and left the room. Brandon tried to follow. The bailiff stopped him. I turned to look at him. He wasn't smirking anymore, and he had no idea what was in that envelope. But I did. The courthouse hallway felt colder after that hearing. Quieter, too, like even the building was holding its breath. Brandon paced back and forth like a caged animal, muttering to himself, his lawyer standing a few steps away, trying not to look like he regretted ever taking the case. My parents sat stiffly on the bench near the exit. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father kept glancing between me and Brandon, like he couldn't decide whose side he should be on anymore. I didn't say anything. I just walked right past them, not with anger, but with something harder, clarity. I got in my car and drove straight to the pier. Not home, not to Jordan's, just somewhere I could breathe. I sat by the water for hours, the cold wind slicing through my coat, my mind still buzzing from what had just happened. The envelope. Exhibit C. I knew what was in it, but I didn't know what it would do. I'd never wielded that kind of power before, and now that I had, the weight of it started to settle into my chest. It wasn't victory I felt. Not yet. It was something closer to gravity. When I got home that night, my apartment felt different. The same furniture, the same humming fridge, the same framed degrees and certificates on the wall, but everything looked smaller. For years, I'd carried the weight of my family on my shoulders, trying to earn a kind of peace that never came. And now, with the structure of that burden cracking, I felt the void underneath it. I sat on the edge of my bed, stared at the floor, and let myself feel the drop. That was my fall. The days that followed blurred together. I went to work, did what I had to do, answered questions about the review, smiled when necessary. But inside, I felt hollow. Betrayal like that doesn't just sting, it corrodes. You question everything. Not just your brother's loyalty, but your own sanity for ever believing he'd change. You replay old conversations, wondering which ones were lies and which ones were just manipulation disguised as love. The night after the hearing, I got a text from my mom. It said, "We didn't raise you to be so vindictive." That was it. No, are you okay? No, how are you holding up? Just that. A single sentence that stabbed deeper than anything Brandon had done. Because in her eyes, I wasn't the son who'd paid 5 years of rent. I was the traitor who dared to stand up. I didn't reply, and I didn't sleep. I stopped eating right, lost weight, started getting headaches. Even the people at work, people I barely talked to, began asking if I was all right. I kept saying yes, but my eyes were tired, my voice flat. I'd built a reputation at my job for being dependable, consistent, efficient, and now I was unraveling, quietly, in the background. Jordan noticed. Of course he did. He showed up at my place one Friday with 2 bags of groceries and a folder of his own. I opened the door, barely awake, and he pushed past me like a man on a mission. "I made a list," he said. "A list?" He slapped the folder onto my kitchen counter. "Things you care about. Things you're good at. Things you haven't done in forever. You've been in survival mode so long, you forgot who you are." I didn't respond. I just stared at the folder. He sighed. "Look, Harry, you got hit by a truck. Not a literal one, but the kind that wrecks your soul. And you're trying to walk it off like it's a stubbed toe. It's not. You need to heal. And healing isn't passive. You have to work at it." Then he pulled out 2 old photos. One of me at a community tech fair, grinning in front of a booth with kids coding tiny games on Raspberry Pis. The other was from my college graduation, where I was hugging my mentor with tears in my eyes. "You used to light up when you talked about tech. You used to volunteer. You used to build things for you, not just for a paycheck." Where did that guy go? I wanted to say something snarky, wanted to make a joke, but I didn't, because I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. "I think he's still in there," Jordan said, "but he needs a reason to come back." That night, I stared at those photos long after Jordan left, and something shifted. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the memory of hope, like a spark in a long-dead fireplace. So I started small. I dug out my old laptop, the one I used for side projects before life got too heavy. I opened an old codebase for a budgeting app I'd once designed for low-income students. It was half-finished, clunky, and riddled with bugs. But I stared at it like it was an old friend I hadn't seen in years. I spent the next few weekends rebuilding it. Not for profit. Not for anyone else. Just because I could. I'd forgotten how satisfying it was to solve problems without pressure, to create something out of nothing. I added features. Polished the UI. Started using it myself. And for the first time in weeks, I felt in control of something. Then I began volunteering again, just a couple hours on Saturdays at a youth coding center downtown. The kids were shy at first, but once they saw how passionate I was about tech, they warmed up fast. One kid, Malik, asked me if I'd always been this smart. I laughed and told him no. I just failed a lot faster than everyone else. That line stuck with me. Fail fast. Learn faster. I started applying that to my own life. I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to try. I picked up my gym membership again. Stopped ordering takeout. Started cooking simple meals. I even took a digital detox one weekend. No emails, no news, no doom scrolling. Just books, music, and long walks. It wasn't some magical overnight recovery, but it was movement. And movement felt like progress. Then, something unexpected happened. My app, the budgeting one I'd revived, started getting attention. I'd posted about it on a small developer forum just for feedback, and someone shared it on a financial literacy blog. Traffic spiked. Emails poured in. A nonprofit reached out, asking if they could use it in their workshops. I said yes, of course, then added features they requested. Word spread. Another organization contacted me, then a local credit union. Within a month, I had hundreds of users. By the second month, it was in the thousands. I wasn't making money from it, not yet, but I was building value. And for once, I wasn't doing it under someone else's name. This was mine. No Brandon. No parents. No guilt. Just me. I didn't even tell anyone. Not Jordan. Not my coworkers. Not even the volunteer center. I just kept working on it, quietly, like a secret garden growing behind a broken house. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from my company's VP of engineering. He'd seen the app. Apparently someone on the exec team used it and recognized my name. He said he was impressed. Said he hadn't realized I had that kind of initiative. That kind of vision. 3 days later, I was invited to pitch a new internal tool to the product board. They were considering me for a leadership track. I hung up the phone, sat at my desk, and stared at the wall for a long time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I finally did. I was building a life that wasn't tied to Brandon's needs, my parents' approval, or anyone else's expectations. For the first time in years, I was choosing me. But life has a cruel sense of timing. Because just as things were starting to turn around, just as I was learning how to stand tall again, I got an email from my parents. Subject: we need to talk. It's important. The body was short. They wanted to meet. In person. At their house. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it. Part of me wanted to print it out and light it on fire. But the part of me that had spent years craving their validation still flinched. So I replied. I said I'd come by the following Sunday. 1 hour. That's it. I didn't know what to expect when I pulled into their driveway. I hadn't been there in months. The rose bushes were overgrown. The lawn a little patchy. But the porch light was still that same soft yellow it had always been. I rang the bell. My mom opened the door. And the look on her face wasn't anger anymore. It was something else entirely. She stepped aside without a word. And as I walked into the living room, I saw Brandon already seated at the table, next to a man in a dark suit. A lawyer. I should have trusted the pit in my stomach. From the second I saw Brandon seated at that table, arms crossed, smug, I knew this wasn't an olive branch. This was a trap. And like an idiot, I'd walked right into it. The man next to him was lean, suited, and carried himself with that oily confidence that made my skin crawl. He looked like the type who billed by the minute and smiled when families tore each other apart. My parents sat across from them, silent. My mom's hands were clenched together in her lap. My dad wouldn't even look up. Brandon was the one who broke the silence. Well, he said with a grin. Glad you could make it, Harry. We've got a lot to discuss. I didn't sit down. I just stared at him. You brought your lawyer to Mom and Dad's house. The suited man cleared his throat. Mr. Thomas, my name is Alan Bertram. I represent your brother in several personal and business matters. He's asked me to facilitate this conversation in a professional, documented capacity. Documented capacity? I echoed. What is this? A mediation? Brandon leaned back and folded his arms. You could call it that. Or a courtesy. The nerve. I looked at my parents. You knew this was going to happen? My mother shifted uncomfortably. We didn't know everything. Just that he wanted to speak with you, and you thought it was a great idea to host it in your living room. I finished. Right. Alan opened a folder. Let's get to the point. Brandon is prepared to drop the civil suit in exchange for an agreement. A private settlement. Full confidentiality, no further countersuits, and a mutual non-disparagement clause. He's also requesting compensation for the development of intellectual property tied to his creative projects, which he alleges were directly hindered by your financial interference. I blinked. I actually laughed. A dry, stunned laugh that filled the room like a crack in the ceiling. You dragged me into court, I said. You sent anonymous complaints to my employer. You faked a victim narrative, and now you want me to pay you off to make you go away? Brandon's eyes narrowed. You owe me, Harry. I lost 5 years because of you. You turned me into your little charity case so you could feel superior. You used money to control me. Control. That word. It echoed in my ears like a joke with a mean punchline. I paid your rent, I said, my voice quieter now. I bailed you out. I let you use my name, my credit, my time. And you know what? I'm done being the villain in your story. You've rewritten the past so many times you actually believe your own garbage. Brandon's mouth twisted, but I didn't give him time to respond. I turned to the lawyer. This meeting's over. Alan raised a brow. I'd advise you to think carefully. If we proceed to trial, the litigation will become public. The damages. I want it public, I snapped. I want every detail laid bare. Because the only thing worse than being stabbed in the back is being expected to apologize for bleeding. I walked out. Didn't even say goodbye. Drove straight to Jordan's place, heart pounding like a war drum. And the second he opened the door and saw my face, he just stepped aside and said, Okay, what did they do now? I told him everything. And by the time I was done, the plan had already started forming in my head. This time, I wasn't going to wait for the next attack. I was going to set the board myself. It started with research. Brandon had always been careless with his digital footprint. He liked attention too much. Over the years, I'd seen him bounce from one half-baked startup idea to another, an app for mood-based playlists, a crypto-themed clothing brand, even a mobile game that was basically a Candy Crush ripoff. He'd leave traces of them online, expired domains, outdated social media accounts, and worst of all, brag posts on forums under his real name. With some digging, I discovered something interesting. One of his projects, a short film he claimed had been stolen by a festival judge, was in fact nearly identical to a student project uploaded 3 years earlier on Vimeo. Word-for-word dialogue, same camera angles. Brandon had just reshot it with his face in it and slapped his name on the credits. I wasn't surprised. I kept digging. Found invoices he'd sent to a local business claiming he was doing freelance branding work, except the client, a friend of mine, said they'd never received the deliverables. He just ghosted after taking the deposit, she said. Didn't know how to pursue it. I helped her file a small claims suit. Found 2 more. Then, I requested a copy of the police report from when Brandon got pulled over 2 years ago, the one where he begged me to cover the impound fee and never told anyone. It wasn't just a busted tail light. It was a DUI, on a suspended license. That, too, was added to my growing dossier. Next came the quiet allies. You'd be surprised how many people Brandon had burned over the years. A former roommate reached out to me after seeing a vague social media post I'd made about family betrayal. He said Brandon left him holding the lease when he skipped town on rent. Another ex-colleague sent me screenshots of texts where Brandon admitted to inflating his resume with fake coding skills. Skills I now knew he never developed. Piece by piece, I built the case. Not for court. Not for revenge in the loud, petty sense. I was building something deeper. Something precise. I consulted a defamation attorney. Shared the harassment emails Brandon sent anonymously. Shared proof that they originated from his devices. Data I got with Jordan's help and a bit of forensic tracking. We crafted a counterclaim that didn't just expose his lies, but laid out his pattern of financial and emotional manipulation. But I didn't file it. Not yet. Because I needed the timing to be perfect. Then came the email. I sent it to Brandon. Subject line. 1 chance. Body. Let's meet. Public place. No lawyers. You talk. I listen. I picked the cafe near my old college campus. Neutral ground. Full of people. Cameras. Witnesses. He showed up late, wearing sunglasses like he was dodging paparazzi. I'm only here because Mom asked me to, he said, sitting across from me like we were negotiating a hostage release. I nodded. Good. Let's talk like brothers then. For 15 minutes, I let him vent. He ranted about how I'd stolen his potential, about how I'd ruined his name with my slander, about how he was the only creative one in the family and no one had ever supported him the way he needed. And when he finally stopped, breathing heavy, waiting for me to react, I pulled out a USB stick, set it on the table. This, I said, is the record of everything. Every message, every payment, every time you lied, ghosted, scammed, or stole. I have statements. I have victim testimony. I even have raw footage of your fake film shoot using plagiarized scripts. He went pale. You're bluffing, he said, voice flat. No, I said. I'm patient. And very, very tired. I slid a second envelope across the table. A cease and desist. The terms were simple. Drop the suit. Apologize in writing. Agree to a private arbitration that would result in a structured repayment plan for the money I'd spent over the last 5 years. And most importantly, never speak about me in public again. Ever. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make threats. I just laid it out, clean and cold. You wanted to play games, I said. But I built the board. He didn't speak. He just stared. And for once, the silence wasn't mine to bear. I stood up, left the USB on the table, and walked out. Didn't even look back. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. Because I still hadn't revealed everything in that envelope. Exhibit C, the one I'd handed the judge before she left the courtroom, it contained something else. A signed affidavit from someone very close to Brandon. Someone who'd been part of a fake startup team he once listed on a grant application for $20,000 in state funds. That person had flipped, testified that Brandon used their name without permission, forged documents, and received the funds, then spent it on a gaming laptop and studio lights. Fraud. And if that came out in open court, Brandon wouldn't just lose his case. He'd lose a lot more. The hearing was just 5 days away. The morning of the final hearing felt strangely calm. Not peaceful. Calm in the way a deep ocean is calm before it swallows a ship whole. Cold, steady, inevitable. I woke early, made coffee, straightened the stack of files on my table, and took one last look at Exhibit C. Not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of what was about to happen. Years of manipulation, guilt, lies, financial drain, emotional exhaustion. Every ounce of it was about to be reckoned with. I arrived at the courthouse 10 minutes early. Jordan texted me, "You got this." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His support was one of the few constants in this whole mess. A reminder that real loyalty doesn't need to be begged for or bribed. It just exists. Inside the courtroom, Brandon was already seated with his lawyer. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, drawn, pale, jittery. The swagger was gone. The sunglasses were gone. Even the fake confidence had cracked. His knee bounced under the table like he was trying to shake the fear out of his body. My parents were in the back again, but this time their expressions were different. My mother looked worried. Real worry, not the performative kind she used to flash whenever Brandon faced consequences. My father looked tired. Not angry, not disappointed, just tired, like the illusion he'd clung to for decades had finally collapsed. The judge walked in with the same steady posture she always had, but something about her expression told me she'd spent serious time reviewing the documents. She set her glasses down, looked directly at Brandon, then at me, and said, "Let's begin." Brandon's lawyer went first. He tried to shift the tone, claiming miscommunications, emotional distress, family pressure, and misinterpretations of intent. It was a weak attempt at damage control. Even he didn't sound like he believed the words coming out of his own mouth. When he finished, the judge looked at me. "Mr. Thomas, your counterclaim and supplemental evidence will be addressed now." I stood, calm as stone. "Yes, Your Honor." And then I laid everything out. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with precision. I presented the anonymous emails sent to my employer, cross-referenced with metadata tying them to Brandon's IP address and device ID. I presented testimony from his former roommate, the businesses he'd taken deposits from and ghosted, and the individuals he'd listed as team members, on fake applications without their knowledge. I presented the evidence from the forensics report, timestamps, login patterns, cached files from his computer that contradicted the claims he'd made in his lawsuit. And then, carefully, I handed the judge Exhibit C, the affidavit, signed, notarized, detailed. It outlined the grant fraud, the forged signatures, the misuse of funds, and Brandon's statement, captured in text messages, that he needed the money for gear, and the state wouldn't notice anyway. The judge read the affidavit slowly, methodically. When she finally set it down, she looked at Brandon with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, disappointment. "Mr. Thomas," she said, addressing him, "this court does not look kindly on deceit, especially when it is used to weaponize the legal system. Your actions were irresponsible at best, malicious at worst, and verging on criminal." Brandon swallowed hard. For a moment, I thought he might faint. His lawyer whispered urgently to him. Brandon shook his head, eyes wide. The whispering grew more frantic. Finally, the lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw his complaint and is open to discussing settlement terms." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Settlement terms are no longer yours to dictate." She turned to me. "Mr. Thomas, do you wish to proceed with your counterclaim?" The room went silent. Every pair of eyes landed on me. I felt the weight of the moment. Not just the revenge, but the release. The ending I had earned, not by force, but by finally choosing myself. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I do." What followed was a dismantling. A thorough, unflinching breakdown of Brandon's lawsuit, his harassment, his lies, his targeted attempts to sabotage my job and reputation. The judge didn't hold back. She reprimanded him for attempting to manipulate the court, for creating false narratives, for abusing legal channels to harass a family member who had supported him for years. And then, the ruling came. The judge dismissed Brandon's original lawsuit with prejudice, meaning he could never bring those claims again. She approved my counterclaim. Brandon was ordered to pay restitution for the rent, credit charges, and financial damages over the last 5 years. Pay additional fines for harassment. Reimburse legal fees, mine, not his. Attend mandatory financial accountability counseling. Provide a written apology submitted to the court, acknowledging all wrongdoing. But the biggest blow? The case file, including the affidavit about the grant fraud, was forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. When the judge said those words, Brandon's face drained so fast he looked translucent. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Brandon pulled away like he'd touched a live wire. My mother let out a soft gasp. My father closed his eyes like he finally understood the consequences of years spent choosing the easiest narrative instead of the truest one. The hearing ended. The judge left. People started shuffling out. Brandon stayed seated, frozen. I walked past him without slowing. He grabbed my sleeve. "Harry, please. You can't let them." I pulled my arm back. Not harshly, just firmly. "I didn't do this to you," I said. "You did." He shook his head, tears pooling. "But I'm your brother." I paused, not because I doubted myself, but because for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not as the golden boy, not as the burden I had to carry, not as the monster he'd grown into. Just as a man who had built his whole life out of excuses and expected everyone else to hold up the structure. "You stopped being my brother," I said quietly, "the moment you tried to destroy me." I walked away, and this time, I didn't look back. The fallout came quickly. Within 2 weeks, Brandon's grant fraud investigation became formal. His bank accounts were reviewed, his digital files subpoenaed, and the organization that had awarded him the funds publicly removed his name from their site. His landlord evicted him. His car was repossessed. His friends, mostly fair-weather types drawn to the version of himself he performed online, drifted away. My parents tried to intervene, but after realizing the extent of what he'd done, even they couldn't justify it anymore. The illusion was shattered. The golden boy wasn't golden, just hollow. My dad tried to apologize to me. My mom tried too, but it came out tangled, half guilt, half regret. I didn't reject them, but I also didn't let them rewrite history. Healing would take time, maybe years, but I wasn't angry anymore. I had finally let go. And as for me, the leadership pitch at my job was approved. I began overseeing a development team for internal tools. My budgeting app officially partnered with 2 nonprofits. I started sleeping again, eating again, living again. My world stopped shrinking and started expanding in ways I never expected. And strangely enough, the thing that healed me most wasn't winning in court. It wasn't exposing Brandon. It wasn't even the apology he eventually wrote in shaky handwriting, admitting everything. It was this simple truth. I finally understood that helping someone self-destruct is not kindness. Protecting someone from consequences is not love. And sacrificing yourself to save someone who's determined to drown will only pull you under with them. I built a new life, brick by brick, choice by choice, not for them, for me. And on the first morning I woke up in that new life, with sunlight pouring into my apartment and my phone buzzing with a partnership offer for my app, I realized something. The real revenge wasn't what happened to Brandon. The real revenge was becoming untouchable. And that's when I knew the story was over. Because I finally stopped playing the role they wrote for me and started writing my own.